Thank you, all of you. And really, this is a very treasured award for me, and I'm so honored to be here because this really feels like coming home. First of all, I'm so delighted to be among some of the friends with which I was in mission in El Salvador here tonight. And also because this organization really represents some of the greatest aspirations of my own life, to be really Franciscan, mission and service. So it isn't often in my experience that those elements all come together. So tonight this really is a joy for me to be in the midst of you. Also, I know that for any of you who have lived in other countries and other cultures, you're also aware that there isn't easily a place or a home for that experience afterwards. So I really have a deep sense of identification with anyone here who is a current or a returned missioner and has experienced both the incredible resiliency as well as the vulnerability of the people we've accompanied. It really has been our privilege to share life with them. They have been our teachers and our friends and our evangelizers, and we will never be the same. And of course, you know that I was the president of LCWR at a very interesting time. And I'm sure that's part of why it occurred to Franciscan Mission Service to give me this Anselm Moons Award tonight. But because of that, I want to receive this award in the name of all of the women religious represented by LCWR, because I recognize your solidarity with all of us. And I also want you to know that the women of LCWR stand in solidarity with all of you in our shared desire for a renewed church and for a life of genuine faithfulness to the gospel. You can guess that my experience in both Chile and El Salvador is the greatest resource I have brought to the experience of leadership in LCWR. I have had the opportunity and the privilege of living in the midst of a people's struggle for liberation 2 times in 2 places. And because I know I'm among foreign missioner friends here, I would like to indulge myself with a few missioner stories, because I want to share with you some of the things I've learned that have been important to me in dealing with the challenge that we've faced nationally. And I think some of you also who have had experience in other countries and cultures probably experience that many times you're in one setting and there's a whole other script that's playing inside that never gets talked about. And I want to share with you some of the script that's been playing in me with the LCWR challenge. First lesson is that courage is contagious. And that the smallest gesture of courage or of resistance can shift the dynamic on a larger scale and give hope in difficult situations. That has been my experience over and over again. So I just want to give you a couple of examples of that. First of all, I lived in El Salvador in a town called Suchitoto, which was in the middle of an area that had been emptied out with aerial bombings. But the town itself had a military presence, and the entire surrounding area was under guerrilla control. So it had been an area in which there was great persecution of the church. So as refugees began to return to resettle, no one wanted to be associated with the church because people previously who had been associated with the church were assassinated. There were no catechists, no children being prepared for First Communion. Everyone was afraid to do that. And all of a sudden there was an elderly man, originally from that town, who had gone to Canada for safety, who came back, and he said, I'm going to die, I'm old, I want to die here, and I want to die as the catechist I always was. So he started. When I left, there were 150 catechists. So his courage to come back in the middle of the war and to take up that role was one example of courage being contagious. Anyway, some of these experiences are part of the tapes that play in the back of my mind when some of the LCWR experiences have come up. And it's made it clear to me in LCWR's recent conflict with the Vatican that our small attempts to respond with integrity and courage to express conscience can fan into flame a hopeful spirit on a much larger scale, and that's really what we've been experiencing. Another lesson: when there are two opposing sides, we are still one. And whatever the conflict, someday it will be over and we will have to live with each other. So relationship building at every stage is important. When I went to Chile in 1980, there were two of us together, and after a little time in Santiago, we went to Arica in the north on the border with Peru. And like all good missionaries learn accompaniment and presence, we decided, thank you, that we would do no work for 6 months. That we would just visit homes and talk to the people and learn about the culture. So we were doing that. First week, visiting homes, we went to a house and talked to two young teenagers. And they invited us to a party. We thought, this is great. We'll go see how Chileans do parties. And they said their uncle was going to drive. So he picked us up at a certain time and we all went to a party in a house in a different part of the city. But we noticed that he was drinking heavily. We thought, oh, this is not good. Let's just ask him to take us home while there's still time. So we did. And he started to drive us home. And of course, Chile, you know, has a huge coastline, and we were in a port city. So on the way home, he said, let's stop and walk along the beach. So we got out of the car, and here we are walking along the beach. This man has been drinking. It's dark. Now, if you're thinking that this is foolish, I hope FMS has a better orientation for the new volunteers so they don't ever get in this kind of position. But here we are walking along the beach. And all of a sudden, this man burst into tears. And he said, I have tortured so many people. And I can't live with myself, and I just drink. And then he started pouring out lots of really awful stories. And I have been forever grateful for that experience, because my first week there, I experienced the damage done to the oppressors. And I could never demonize the military and the torturers after that, having heard the story of that man. So it was a very instructive experience for me. And I learned in a very experiential way that there is human hurting humanity, human pain on all sides of a conflict. That's one story. That has been one of the scripts in the back of my mind as we've approached the conflict with the Vatican. Another one was When the peace accords were signed in El Salvador, one of the first times I went into the capital afterwards, into San Salvador, there was a demonstration going on. Well, there are always demonstrations going on, but I approached to see what was happening. And this was one of the most joyful moments in my life, I think, in El Salvador. It was a group of former combatants of the guerrillas and the military together. And they were marching on some government building, demanding indemnization as disabled veterans. And I thought to myself, 2 months ago they were shooting at each other. How did they do this? How did they come to that? And it was really a moment of joy for me. And when I think too of the position we're in, someday conflicts will be over and we will need to be able to join forces to be one together. So those are kind of dramatic situations from more violent contexts, but they express a truth that I have carried with me ever since. That we share a common faith, a common humanity, a common pain with those on the opposite side of church polarizations and all other polarizations. So if we can really hear each other, we have a head start on experiencing our fundamental connectedness. Now, here are a couple of learnings from the Franciscan context. And I have to confess that one day, when I was discouraged with the church, I picked up the book, Francis and the Foolishness of God. And I do not say that because Joan Engel and Marie Dennis are here. But I read that little book, and when I closed it, I remember thinking to myself, gee, Francis really didn't fight with the church, even in that very conflicted time of the 12th century. He didn't fight with anybody. He just joyfully went about creating something new. So it's clear to me in our time as well that that's what we're being called to do. Francis' style of rebuilding the church wasn't about knocking anything down and starting over. He never severed relationships with those with whom he disagreed. He simply joyfully went about creating something new. And then before he knew it, he had 5,000 followers. So that life of poverty and minority and scandalous inclusivity and passionate love for the crucified one was startling and refreshing and full of hope. And that's what served to rebuild the church. So in our time, I think what we're called to do is to discover what is the new thing that we're being called to create that will breathe new life into our church and in our world. It also gives me great pleasure to reflect on the fact that LCWR members have been trying to do that. For the last few years, we've been engaged in a communal, contemplative reflection process in an attempt to listen more deeply to the movement of the Spirit and to discover God's leading at this moment in time. And I think that's actually pretty Franciscan. And then another learning is more recent. I think all of us have just had such encouragement with the election of Pope Francis. And with that, there's a whole new awareness of Francis of Assisi. But I've been struck with the fact that even before his election, there was an interest in Francis coming from some surprising places. And several weeks ago, some of you may have seen this, the New Yorker magazine had a review of 2 books by about Francis of Assisi by Joan Acosella. And in that, there was a segment in larger type that said this: for the church, Francis was too revered not to claim, but too radical not to neutralize. Now that's an interesting commentary to appear in the New Yorker. And I've actually thought a lot about it. Even before Francis' death, as you know, his own followers started to move towards what looked like a more mainstream type of life than what Francis had envisioned. And we know that he was very pained by that. And if the truth be told, all of us who claim to follow Francis and Clare fall short of St. Francis' original desire to simply pattern his life on the gospel. But if we can help each other not to be neutralized by any influence that finds the radical following of Jesus too dangerous, then we will have really honored one another. So thank you for honoring me tonight with this award. I'm very grateful.